The church bells rang, but no one was smiling. You stood at the altar in a dress that wasn't yours, borrowed from a cousin you barely knew. The man beside you was a stranger. You'd met him twice before today. Once at your father's house, where he looked you over like livestock at market. Once at the signing of the contract, where you weren't allowed to speak. Now you were his. Legally, completely, irreversibly his. Your father had made the arrangement 3 months ago. You weren't asked, you weren't consulted. The marriage wasn't about love or happiness or building a life together. It was about money, about land, about debts your father needed to settle. And now, as the priest spoke words you could barely hear over the pounding of your own heart, you understood that your life as you knew it was over. You were 17 years old, and you had just become property. In the early to mid-1700s, marriage across England, colonial America, and much of Europe had nothing to do with romance. It was a legal transaction, a business arrangement between families. Love was considered dangerous, a distraction that led to poor decisions. Marriage was about survival, about maintaining social order, about transferring wealth and property from one generation to the next. Women had no legal rights once they married. Everything they owned became their husband's property. Their money, their land, even their clothes. They couldn't sign contracts. They couldn't sue in court. They couldn't leave, no matter what happened behind closed doors. Men, meanwhile, were expected to provide financially, but that was where their obligations largely ended. A husband could beat his wife, and as long as he didn't kill her, the law rarely intervened. The phrase rule of thumb came from the idea that a man could strike his wife with a stick as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. Divorce was nearly impossible. In England, it required an act of parliament, something only the wealthiest could afford. For everyone else, marriage was permanent. If you made a bad match, you lived with it until one of you died. And most marriages were bad matches. Catherine Welch was 15 when her parents arranged her marriage. She grew up in a small village outside Bristol, the daughter of a shopkeeper who owed money to a local merchant. The merchant had a son, Robert, who was 28 and needed a wife. Catherine's father saw an opportunity to clear his debt and secure his daughter's future in one move. Catherine wasn't asked what she wanted. Her mother told her she should be grateful. Grateful that someone was willing to take her. Grateful that she wouldn't end up a spinster or a burden. Catherine met Robert twice before the wedding. He barely spoke to her. He looked at her the way you'd look at a piece of furniture you were considering buying. On their wedding day, she wore her mother's old dress, altered to fit. The ceremony lasted 10 minutes. Afterward, there was a small meal at her father's house, and then Robert took her to his home on the edge of town. She'd never been there before. She walked through the door and realized she had no idea what kind of life waited for her inside. She was no longer Catherine Welch. She was Catherine Porter, and she no longer belonged to herself. Marriage didn't start with a honeymoon or a period of adjustment. It started with work. Catherine's job was to run the household. That meant cooking every meal from scratch over an open fire. It meant hauling water from the well, sometimes multiple trips a day. It meant washing clothes by hand in cold water, scrubbing them against rocks until her knuckles bled. It meant making soap, candles, and preserving food for winter. It meant spinning thread, sewing clothes, and mending everything that tore. The work never stopped. There were no days off, no breaks. If she didn't do it, it didn't get done. Robert worked as a merchant, buying and selling goods in town. He left early and came home late. When he was home, he expected meals ready, the house clean, and Catherine available whenever he wanted her. She had no say in when or how often. Refusal wasn't an option. The law stated that a wife's body belonged to her husband. What we'd call assault today was simply considered a husband's right. Catherine got pregnant 4 months after the wedding. She was still 15. There were no doctors in the village, just a midwife who delivered dozens of babies and lost nearly as many. Catherine had no idea what to expect. No one had explained it to her. When the labor started, it lasted 16 hours. She thought she was going to die. The baby, a girl, lived 3 days before fever took her. Catherine wasn't allowed time to grieve. There was too much work to do. People didn't talk about the marriage. Neighbors didn't ask how things were going. It wasn't considered anyone's business. Catherine's mother visited once a month, but they never discussed Robert or what happened in the house. It was understood that marriage was private, that whatever difficulties existed were to be endured quietly. Catherine had no friends. Robert didn't want her spending time with other women. He said they'd fill her head with complaints and dissatisfaction. So she stayed home. She worked. She waited for Robert to come back each day, never knowing what mood he'd be in. Some days he ignored her completely. Other days he'd find fault with everything. The bread was too hard. The house was too cold. She'd taken too long at the well. Those were the days he'd shout, and sometimes his anger went beyond shouting. Catherine learned not to respond. She learned to keep her face blank, her voice quiet. She learned that crying only made things worse. At night, she'd lie awake and think about the life she'd imagined as a child. She'd thought marriage would mean having her own home, her own family, some measure of independence. Instead, she had less freedom than she'd had living with her parents. She couldn't go anywhere without permission. She couldn't spend money. She couldn't even visit her own family without Robert's approval. And there was no way out. This was her life now, until one of them died. If you'd been born in that time, and your parents told you that you'd be marrying someone you didn't know, someone you hadn't chosen, someone who would legally own you, what would you have said? Would you have obeyed, knowing that refusal meant being cut off from your family, left with no money and no prospects? Or would you have fought, even knowing the fight was already lost? Childbirth was the most dangerous part of marriage. Women died in labor constantly. Infection, hemorrhaging, complications that no one knew how to treat. Catherine got pregnant again a year after losing her first child. This time, the labor was even worse. 20 hours. She begged for it to stop. The midwife told her to be quiet, that screaming wouldn't help. The baby, a boy, was born blue and silent. The midwife tried to revive him but couldn't. Catherine hemorrhaged badly afterward. She lost so much blood that she couldn't stand for 2 days. Robert didn't stay with her. He went back to work the next morning. When she finally recovered enough to move around, he told her they'd try again soon. There was no discussion about what she'd been through, no acknowledgement of the 2 children she'd lost, just the expectation that she'd keep trying until a child survived. Over the next 8 years, Catherine got pregnant 6 more times. 3 of the pregnancies ended in miscarriage. 2 resulted in live births, but 1 child died at 6 months and the other at 2 years. Only 1 child, a daughter named Mary, lived past early childhood. By the time Catherine was 25, she'd been pregnant 8 times and had 1 living child to show for it. Her body was wrecked. She had chronic pain in her back and abdomen. She'd lost most of her teeth. She looked 20 years older than she was. But here's the part that changes everything. While women suffered through the physical destruction of repeated pregnancies, men faced almost no consequences. Robert never sat with Catherine during labor. He never helped care for the children who died. He attended the small funerals, stood silently, and then went back to his life as if nothing had happened. For him, marriage was convenient. He had someone to cook, clean, and manage his household. He had a socially acceptable outlet for sex. He had an heir, eventually. But his day-to-day existence barely changed. Catherine, on the other hand, lost everything. Her health, her youth, her autonomy, her identity. And this wasn't unique to her. This was the reality for most married women. The system was designed to benefit men. Women were expected to sacrifice everything, and men were expected to provide financially, but little else. And if a woman complained, if she expressed dissatisfaction or unhappiness, she was labeled difficult, ungrateful, hysterical. The law wouldn't protect her. Society wouldn't support her. She was entirely alone. Think about the expectations placed on marriage today. The idea that it should be based on love, mutual respect, partnership. Now imagine all of that stripped away. Imagine being told that marriage is an obligation, a duty, something you endure rather than enjoy. Would you still want it? Or would you see it for what it really was, a trap? Most women didn't live long. The repeated pregnancies, the constant physical labor, the lack of medical care, all of it added up. Catherine made it to 32. By then, she'd had 2 more pregnancies. One ended in miscarriage. The other resulted in a son who lived, but the labor damaged her so severely that she never fully recovered. She developed an infection that wouldn't go away. Fever came and went. She couldn't keep food down. She grew weaker by the day. Robert didn't call for a doctor. Doctors were expensive, and besides, women got sick. It was normal. Catherine spent her last 3 weeks in bed, too weak to stand. Her daughter Mary, now 11, took over the household work. Catherine died on a Tuesday morning in late winter. Robert buried her in the churchyard with a small wooden marker. Within 6 months, he'd remarried. His new wife was 16. The system didn't stop. It didn't change. Marriage remained a legal arrangement that benefited men and consumed women. The laws didn't shift. Society didn't question whether this was right or fair. It was simply how things were. And the women who suffered through it, who lost their health and their lives to a system that gave them no choice, were forgotten. Their names disappeared from records. Their stories were never told. They became nothing more than entries in parish registers: married, gave birth, died. 3 lines to summarize an entire existence. The comfort and stability that families enjoyed, the social order that kept communities functioning, all of it rested on the silent suffering of women who had no voice and no escape. That's what marriage really was. Not a partnership, not a love story. A structure of control that sacrificed half the population so the other half could thrive. Even after women started to gain some legal rights, after laws began to shift in the 19th and 20th centuries, the damage had been done. Generations of women had already been ground down by a system that saw them as property. And while things improved on paper, the attitudes lingered. The expectation that women should sacrifice, should endure, should put everyone else's needs before their own. Those ideas didn't disappear. They just evolved, took on new forms, hid behind different language. And in some parts of the world, they never changed at all. Marriage in the 1700s wasn't an anomaly. It was a blueprint, and the echoes of that blueprint are still here, quieter now, but present, still shaping expectations, still defining roles, still reminding us that the past isn't as far behind us as we'd like to believe.